Good afternoon and welcome to the Ferguson Library. My name is Alice Knapp and I am very pleased to welcome you to our last program for Black History Month, but although not the last program on this topic as we move forward. Today's program is Black History Month, the past, the present, and the future. And it is my pleasure to welcome you and introduce to you Fritz Cherry, Board of Education member.
Everyone, my name is Frederick and I will be the moderator today on our discussion for Black History Month, past, present, and future. I'm excited today. We have some amazing panelists that are gonna have this discussion with us this afternoon. Before we go ahead and start, I really wanna thank the Ferguson Library for allowing us to use this space. We are here in person. We are practicing social distancing, so all of our panelists are 6 feet apart, but we thought it was important to have this conversation face to face. So here we are today. So thank you again to the Ferguson Library. Real quick, just some announcements with the Ferguson Library. We have on April 15th, registration is open for a novel affair. Join us on April 15th for a fun virtual event to benefit the library. Tickets are free. We welcome donations. Donations of $100 and up receive a special cocktail kit to enjoy during the show. And then we also have on March 11th, the Long Ridge School Diversity Forum 2021. Lies my teacher told me and how to avoid them. So we will have the author James W. Lowen there to lead that. And again, that's going to be Thursday, March 11th at 7 p.m. So those are just two of the announcements that are happening later this year here at the Ferguson Library. And with that, we can go ahead and get started on our discussion. I want to start by introducing our panelists for this evening. We're going to go ahead and start with Jeremy White.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jeremy White. I'm in my 20th year at Stanford High School, sort of my home away from home. I'm a social studies teacher, and I'm just happy to be here and happy to hopefully add something to this panel.
Hello, everyone. My name is Louise Berter. I'm a Stanford resident, born and raised. I recently just graduated from Sacred Heart University for my master's in secondary education, content area social studies. So I'm here to bring a different perspective, some new creative ideas and concepts. That's it.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Crystal Perry Holden. I grew up in Stanford and I've been on the staff of many schools in Stanford Public Schools. Currently, I am the assistant principal at Dolan Middle School, and I'm happy to be here. And I'd like to say thank you to the Ferguson Library. I have actually participated in other events, and I appreciate your commitment to actually recognizing Black History Month and doing events every year. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bianca Shin. I'm a longtime Stanford native, and I'm currently on the executive board of directors for the League of Women Voters. And I currently work in my community here at Domus Kids with our students. And I'm very passionate about voter engagement among Black and Brown kids. And thank you, Ferguson Library, for also having here. And thank you too, Fritz, for hosting this rich debate discussion that we're gonna have.
Debate discussion, whatever you want. Let's go. Hey, listen, we're going to jump right into it. First and foremost, what is Black History Month? What is it?
I'll start. Black History Month, and what is Black History? Black History first, what it is it's the experiences, it's the culture, the traditions, the legacy of people of African descent. And when we look at Black history, we cannot look at Black history and looking at it just focusing on American history, because we have to start at the beginning. We have to start back in Africa. We have to look at the great empires of West Africa. We have to look at the empires of Ghana, of Mali, of Songhai, and how it started and go back there. When we talk about Black History Month, we do give recognition to Dr. Carter G. Woodson in 1926 when he established, which was Black History Week, not Black History Month. It was Black History Week at that time. And he decided to do it the second week of February to also acknowledge the birthdays of Abraham Lincoln as well as abolitionist Frederick Douglass. And then 50 years later, President Gerald Ford actually recognized it as Black History Month. So at that time, it was established as Black History Month. And we are now in 2021, and we are still celebrating Black History Month. And we're spending 28 days, sometimes 29 days if there's a leap year. And that's the time that we have to recognize the accomplishments of many people across the globe. And we're going to get a little bit more into that.
I'd like to add, so Ms. Perry spoke a lot about the origins of Black history, but also history is what remains. So in my opinion, I believe it's American history, it's world history, it's history in general. And, you know, as Ms. Perry alluded to, we celebrate the accomplishments, the achievements of notable figures and dates, but also to me is the narration of influential persons, right? With the Harlem Renaissance. It's also the persistence with the Civil Rights Movement. It's also individuals who illustrated patriotism with the Civil War. So, and also it's the oppression, right? And the undermined as we see today. So Black history to me is a combination of all those things that I listed. And I think it's something that as we move forward in our society is going to be more emphasized and also more celebrated universally instead of just a month.
Yeah, and you know, to piggyback on what Lou's saying, I think you can't talk about American history without talking about Black history. So much of what we have in America and the way America is sort of structured now is the remnants of what has happened in the past, right? To your point, I think America's obviously diverse. America has a crazy history to it in many, many different ways. But I think the one thing that's always persisted throughout the history of this country is the struggle of Black Americans. And I think that's just what it is. There's really no way to separate it. And you know, the discussion as to how we stop doing that, I think is an important discussion to have, especially as somebody who teaches social studies, somebody who is teaching social studies as young as you now. You can't separate the two because they've never been separated anyway.
In line with that question of what is Black history is what is Black History Month? Are we saying, I guess the question then becomes, is Black History Month celebrating history here in America, Black history specifically here in America, or is it Black history around the world?
I would say for Black's history, to me, it's a celebration of our ancestors. So when we're celebrating our ancestors, it's part of the world because our ancestors started from Africa and then it moved around the diaspora. So you cannot talk about Black history without acknowledging the diaspora. When you think of our ancestors, every time we talk about Black history every year, it's a tribute to them. The tribute to their struggles from being enchained, being brought to a country, to a whole continent. They didn't know the language and they survived. And with that survival, we've become embraced into the history. And when I say it's the diaspora, when you talk, it's the Black diaspora is so vast. We can start from Haiti, coming from my Haitian American background. When you talk about the first revolution of a first Black republic in 1804, that did not even start in 1804. That started 10, 15 years. You had that 1804 revolution that started, that contributed to it being the first Black republic, in which then Frederick Douglass years later became its first ambassador representing it. And when the revolution happened in Haiti, it impacted the whole African Americans, slaves that were in the Americas, because it was like, we have to cut them off from that part of the world. So when we say, since we are in the United States, we talk about it because it's so vast, the Black history. So it's so vast, but it's so interconnected. It has to be global.
To talk about slavery in America and not talk about the slave revolt in Haiti is why we don't do that, why it's not in the history books is part of the problem. The fear that plantation owners had based on what was coming out of Haiti changed the way that they treated their slaves on their plantations. I mean, it's an unbelievable story that's just not really told for some reason in history classes.
And it's purposeful because even after the 1804, Haiti was blocked off from the world for a good 30 years. So there were no connection. People were not, they were every now and then they're like, oh, I heard about this great revolution. What happened? So it's purposeful when we're not hearing it in the history book, whether it's Haiti and other slave revolts that happened in plantations in the Southern Hemisphere, in the South.
But also to add to that too, and just knowing that Haiti was the economic capital of the world at one point, just based off the natural resources that it had. So just to add to what you guys are saying, I think it is essential that we, include, the Southern plantations of, Barbados and the slave revolts that took place there and the attempt in Antigua. So, and it is, as a historian myself, just thinking back on it, it's almost, it leaves you puzzled because, in history books, everything is Eurocentric, right? It's whitewashed. So that these events that took place are very essential for our kids to know, because when you look at slavery as a whole, right, is sometimes you could think like, hey, why didn't African Americans or Africans revolt? Like how many of the revolts took place? But then there were actual events that took place or attempts, right? But it's just not spoken in our history books. It's not written in our history books. It's not really discussed in our classrooms. So it's almost like the huge migration of African people from a continent is almost like we were like surrendered. Our ancestors surrendered to that, when in actuality that wasn't the truth.
So I know where I want to go with the conversation, but let's take it back. Let's take it way back. So this next question is actually going to be more of a personal question. What was Black History Month for you growing up or in your past? For me personally, I mean, I definitely didn't hear about the Haitian Revolution in high school, even when we were during Black History Month. For me, Black History Month growing up, we spoke on Harriet Tubman. You watch the videos on Martin Luther King Jr. I know at Stanford High back in the day, every morning they would list Black individuals who made amazing advancements in American history specifically. So that was my perspective growing up. Let me hear a little bit about what was it like for you during Black History Month in the past.
I'm interested to know your take on this.
For me?
Yes.
So I remember growing up, and I don't even know if I even remember hearing really anything about Black History Month, to be honest with you. Like I remember going to high school and just, I mean, my knowledge of Black history going through high school was simply the chapter on slavery and and Martin Luther King Jr. And then it kind of just moved on from there. There really wasn't an attempt that I remember. I definitely did not go to a super diverse high school. So I don't think there was really enough of an effort made. At least it didn't make an impression on me. And I remember when we talked about this, Fritz, and that question of what it meant to me, it means something very different to me now that I teach young kids and a really diverse group of young kids. But when I had to reflect on it, I don't think it made an impact on me at all growing up, to be honest with you. It didn't really make an impact on me, I think, till I got to college. And I went to Mary Washington College down in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And, that's Civil War Central, right? And then you start to get all these different perspectives of what it means to be Black in this country. And it was really powerful for me when I went to college. When I was young, though, I don't really remember anything.
I would say as a kid, being introduced to Black History Month, it really gave me, it allowed for me to culturally connect with people from my past, like just ancestors from my past. So I love that. Shout out to, James Moriarty, just a couple of teachers, Mr. Lerner, Scott Lerner at Dolan, Ms. Nuzzle at Dolan too. Those individuals really embrace Black History Month and went in depth. But just to add on to what you said, it means something totally different to me now. As a kid, I loved hearing, just, oh, it's a month of our history, right? Like we really get to dive into it. And now my perspective is different because how do you consolidate an entire race of people into a month? It doesn't, there's so much rich history and it doesn't really, I really believe it's inadequate. Like I'm not really a big supporter of Black History Month, just because I think that is too much information that I think it does a disservice to, you know, the diverse groups of kids, especially in our city, Stanford. So fortunately, I was lucky enough to, you know, attend Stanford Public Schools, which is really diverse. So Black History Month in high school and middle school was always fun for me. But as a kid, it allowed for me to culturally connect with, you know, different individuals like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and their ideologies, like their basic ideologies. And as I gotten older and I really started learning about these individuals, like the Fred Hamptons, the Huey Newtons, now it exposed me to a different variety.
My perspective and experience was slightly different because I conformed to the celebration of Black History Month, but I grew up a little different because I grew up understanding that Black history is every day. And that came from, you know, my parents. My dad is a Baptist minister, a pastor in Stanford, a Union Baptist Church, Reverend Perry. And I was taught that Black history was every single day. And it also attending a historically Black college. I graduated from Howard University. I went to school with Vice President Kamala Harris. She was my classmate. So we didn't just go to the same school, we went at the same time. So that experience had been instilled in me. And when I went to school in high school, actually in middle school as well, it was a little different that it wasn't celebrated every day, but I think I had that voice in me that needed to speak up and to be proactive and start organizations and student organizations and groups. And when I was in high school, I started African American Culture Club in high school. So we actually had programs and we had our voices heard and we did the planning. I don't recall a lot of resistance with that, but it was 1 month, so it was different, you know. And then in high school, it was the same. And when I started teaching, some of you may remember, I did the same at Stanford High School. When I was a teacher at Stanford High School, I actually advocated to have a course, an elective course titled Diverse Perspectives in Literature. And I actually did a little bit of the African American Studies elective course as well and combined that with theater. So I found opportunities to get students active and being able to, you know, express their voices and opinions. And the African Diverse Perspectives in Literature was a great opportunity to have those conversations that weren't easy to have because it was very diverse group of students that actually took that course, and it was full every semester. So it was a little different, but if not, it would have been the Martin Luther King or the Rosa Parks story that we know and not much more.
My experience was more of a repetitive, the same, not taking away from our ancestors, Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, but it felt like it was selective leaders that a group, a structure had selected for us to know and know it very well, to the point by the time your senior year, these 5 or 6 selective, whether through their approach, that you knew their date of birth, their commemorative, what they did. That
was mine. That's what I got, 100%.
Exactly. So coming from my background, coming from my parents who were activists and very involved and we had the opportunity to be around a lot of diaspora intellects, that's where I got the extra. And when I say extra, the Haitian history. So growing up, you would hear the discussion, the historical, and I was like, I've never heard about this in school. I didn't hear about the Haitian perspective or other perspective leaders in the Black diaspora until I went to college. And I can give the shout out to Dr. Fernandez from Central Connecticut State University, who was very involved in Latin American studies that introduced the importance of the diaspora and the impact it had. And that's why I continue to say our ancestors that had impact on Black History Month.
Yeah, that was when I went to Mary Washington, we were lucky enough to have an adjunct professor, was Dr. James Farmer, who taught an unbelievable class on the civil rights movement and And, he introduced us to people like, James Baldwin. And like, then we start reading about, some of these voices that I just never got in high school, and then if you can latch onto that and take that and really understand that that's so much of what the history is not just what we learned in those textbooks. I think that's the goal we're still trying to get to now.
And it's so broad. And I want to give shout out to Miss Perry. Coming from, I went to West Hill.
Miss Perry holds it.
Perry.
My husband's watching.
Oh, Miss Perry Holden. I went to West Hill, the best high school in Stanford.
Here we go.
But a lot of my peers, a lot of my great friends would always talk about your class. They're like, I can't wait to sign up my junior, senior year to take your literature class. And I was on the other end, and I'm like, oh my God, I wish we had that. So just to give you the shout out about the importance that the class, the creativity and the empowerment that you gave, that a community, it's a community resource that was able to benefit from it and be introduced to a lot of literature, not selective literature, but to a variety of Black literature.
I just want to add to that, and I just want to celebrate. Well, I wasn't fortunate enough to have Mr. White as a student and Miss Perry, so my other teachers did a really great job. But just to add to your, your point, it's almost like Black history allows you to be culturally responsive in the classroom, and I think that's really essential. And just to add to what you were saying about the different individuals, it's almost like it's surface level with certain topics that's spoke about in Black history, right? So you introduced James Baldwin, right? So it's like, what were like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X's ideologies, right? One was for isolation, one was integration, right? But why, right? So, and then on top of that, it's like we always separate the two, but James Baldwin is on record for saying before they both died, they were more similar than anything. So it's like these type of conversations need to be had, especially about Black, prominent figures.
Absolutely. I show, once a year, I show, there was a debate between James Baldwin and William F. Buckley Jr. in England in the 60s. And I show it every year because those conversations are still being had today. I believe the resolution of the debate was the American dream is built on the backs of the American Negro.
Right.
I think that's what the resolution was, if I remember correctly, word for word. But it's this really interesting, crazy, conversation that you think about and say, wow, like they were having those talks in the 60s. And then I go on Facebook and the people sound like William F. Buckley Jr. And there are still people who sound like James Baldwin who are going back and forth on social media. And so we still have these conversations today. Like, this has not gone away. This is not something that, just because we learn some names, that the ideologies and the ideas go away. They have to continue to come to the forefront. And it's super important that we do those things.
And the past has a way, the past is connected to our future, to our present and future. Oftentimes people think it's not interlinked. Your past is what's may define your future. So your past is going to help you in current, present to determine which path you're going to take for the future. So that's one of the key things that we have to keep in mind, because oftentimes people are like, oh, that's the past. No, we can never diminish the past, because it's part of the DNA that if we don't understand it or misunderstand it, it's going to continue in the future.
Get stuck in that same,
Right.
it's that cycle.
And,
All right.
and the amount of service that it does. Sorry, first, I know you want to get to the next question.
Oh
I'm sorry.
no, I got some more questions.
But I just want to add like a key point. Just as a kid who comes from the projects in the inner city here, it's also vitally important Black history. And as a kid, you're learning about all these figures, right? And for me, I really love Black History Month during grade schools, because it was the first time where I'm exposed to people who look like me, who did all these amazing things. And it's like when you come from when you grow up disadvantaged, right, it really starts to take a toll on kids, right? It took a toll on my psyche as well. And when you go back home and it's like, all right, I live in this type of neighborhood and I know where I can go because these individuals came from the same environment as myself. So it really helps, and it allows for kids to connect and on a different level other than just academically. It's like, who do I have in common the most with these figures who may have passed away or still currently living? So I think Black History Month, I'm sorry, Black History Month is vitally important in that aspect, doing service for all kids who may grow up disadvantaged or who may grow up advantaged but still have some type of connection.
All right, so now I want to take it there. I'm ready to go a little bit further now. We have our experiences, obviously, of how we learn from Black History Month. I mean, I'm pretty sure everybody learned about Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, maybe Black Wall Street. I don't know. That's one of those question marks. The Black Panther Party, maybe that was in a paragraph somewhere. I mean, I know Judas and the Black Messiah, the film just came out, so that conversation started up again. And then you really ask yourself, there's a very clear, safe list that existed. Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream. And you hear the speech and it looks great, but we don't talk about the assassination much, or the other individuals whose story was not as fun and loving. Medgar Evers and what happened around that time, the ugly of it. So then I guess where I want to go next is there is a set list that we think that everybody learns in schools in Black History Month. But let's just take what has happened in 2020. Let's take a look at what happened last year. As of right now, this is 2021. Everything that happened last year is now history. I mean, you could teach a course now as to what happened in 2020. Take your pick, Black Lives Matter, any of the situations, anything really that has happened with Black people specifically in 2020. Where do we go with that? How do we determine what enters the history books? How do we determine how we take all of that information and now use that to teach the next generation of students in this country and in the world? How do we break that down? Who decides that? Where do we go? How do we take what happened in 2020 and apply it to Black history?
This is where the past is important. In the 1960s, the big civil rights movement, in the 50s to the 1960s, that was the Black Power movement. The same, if you look at the films and you look at the speeches from that time and connect it to 1920 to 2020 to last year, there's no difference. The difference is the media. There's more media, there's more instance. So to connect it, everyone in this room and who's watching has a role. Whether it's Fritz at the Board of Education, you have a role to push the agenda when it comes to the Black and Latino studies. What does it mean as an elective? What are we going to look and evaluate? Just having an elective is not enough. That's just the foundation. What are you going to put in the house is important. Having a foundation without a house that has support and the necessities, then it's useless. And then the other thing with that, each one of us have a role, whether it's to push the envelope and not be quiet, speak up when we say something, when we see something. That's how we push the envelope, because 2020 will happen 5 years from now, or it may happen next week. So there's a lot to capture. Our history, it's our role. We have this Ferguson Library. This is where important when it comes to philanthropy, to fund research and archives. Because a lot of people want to say, oh, how are we going to support this? But there has to be money to support it, to help us tell our story. Telling our story without funding, it's not free, because what about the writers, the researchers? If you're ever going to write a book or even an article on research, to get the best research that's in the last 5 years, that's if you're capturing a current historical, you have to pay journal article, or if you're fortunate enough, you may have it here at the Ferguson Library. So those are all aspects when we're talking about how to capture, to make sure we have to tell our stories, and we have to put the money and the support where we want to tell our stories.
Also, I think just to add to that, and that was excellent. I agree 100%. But for me, I think everything starts with education. I think everything starts in the classroom. As a new teacher and as a teacher as an administrator to my left and a decorated teacher to my right, they definitely know how important and keen it is to have these type of discussions in the classroom, just using these type of events, as I said, being culturally responsive. So you could take different excerpts and quotes from different people. We can always, incorporate it with pre-assessments. There's different ways and different mechanisms to do it. But I think it's really essential that we take certain events that took place, like the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And connect it with protests, right? With the Boston Tea Party. So there's different ways that you can do it and say like, oh, okay, our country was created based off the First Amendment, right? Through protests and free speech. So also connect that like, hey, okay, all these different movements had also protests as well. So connect the Black Lives Matter movement to, the framers of our Constitution. Like, what did they do? What concepts are the same, right? So there's different ways that you could connect it to and make sure that it's more relevant to everything that's going on today. Also, just like, the events that took place with, police brutality and the inequities, right? These are things that's persisting within our very own state. So we can always talk about those type of things, bring up articles. Educators have to come together with the Board of Ed, and if not, just take it as a sole responsibility. Hey, teaching for social justice is something that I believe in, right? How can I give my kids the necessary skills and tools to go out and be productive into the world? I could do that by teaching them these things. If maybe it'd be a mini lesson for 10 minutes, but somehow, some way, that message is being directed and instilled into the kids. And I believe that education is key in this standpoint.
And I think that we can't just limit these things to diverse communities. And I think that's something that happens sometimes. I think there are lots of communities in this country that sort of don't start with the same premise that a community like Stanford starts from. And everybody coming to an agreement that there are and have been since the beginning of this country injustices and those kinds of things, and having an open and honest dialogue about that stuff. Teachers have to be willing to open themselves up and talk about that with kids and make those kids feel comfortable talking about it as well. There's a whole shift that has to be made. And it starts with what you're saying. It starts with that foundation, right? And it can't just happen in communities like Stanford or Norwalk, or it has to happen in all these other areas. It's super important.
How we bridge the gap.
Absolutely.
I have to ask, and somebody just posted on this or added a comment, shout out to Doris, who's educating the educators? So if you're not comfortable having a conversation about racism, and maybe you receive some training on it, then how can you talk to your students or even teach them about what has happened in the past? I'm going to go a step further. Lynching is such an ugly topic, isn't it? I mean, maybe a textbook will actually have a picture of how these lynchings used to happen. It was an event. I mean, hundreds of people would come out and somebody would be burned and hung from a tree. And it's a very hard thing to look at. And we want to think that, that's 70, 80 years ago. There are a number of people that can tell you that happened in 2020 and that it is still something that is happening today.
One happened just about a year ago with Ahmaud Arbery. And I think if you can't call something like that a modern day lynching, and you can't teach that in the classroom, or you're not comfortable enough to teach that in the classroom, then maybe we're getting to a point that teaching might not be for you. We need brave people to do these things. You need to be able to stand up and say, this is what it's been in the past, and linking the past to what's happening today. I mean, how many things have we talked about today that it's like the same conversation from the 1950s and the 1960s that we're hearing about today? It's just, maybe people need to think a little bit more about whether or not they want to get into this kind of a profession.
With all of the pain and the sadness that occurred in 2020, I do believe that there are some blessings that came out of it, and one being the opportunity for everyone to be still. No one could go anywhere. So some of the things that the voices that have been crying out about racial injustice for decades had never been heard, and some of the stories had never been heard. And I think by people sitting still and actually seeing these stories and hearing the reporters, and there's so many documentaries that started to come out, and boards starting to review their policies and on racial discrimination and injustices, and just really just trying to analyze them. I think some things came out of that. I know in Stanford, that was one of the priorities, is for the school district, just looking at our policies for the district and looking at how we are going to treat the curriculum and having some of those courageous conversations. And in Stanford, the administrators, we had some very, very difficult conversations in some of our PD. And it was painful for some to talk about their personal experiences, but the conversations were being had, and that had never happened before, which was a good thing. And it's nice to hear the conversations in the classrooms as well. I'm walking into classrooms and hearing students talk about it, and hearing students using language in terms like white fragility and white privilege, hearing kids talk about it, hearing white kids talk about it.
Right.
And that was really a nice thing to hear, and hearing even the small things, kids saying, wow, I didn't know you couldn't find makeup for Black people, that there were only 4 shades. I didn't realize you couldn't find pantyhose that matched your skin color, things like that. So I think that we are making a few steps, and even not enough, but even in the entertainment industry, Netflix started having a whole section on strong Black characters and movies. Even last night, it just came out, it premiered last night, The United States versus Billie Holiday, talking about lynchings, and that was how she was really like, she had like a mob against her, like a modern day lynching, because of the song that she wrote and sang about lynchings, about strange fruit. So I'm not sure if that movie would have been, produced had we not had an opportunity to sit down, not be able to go anywhere, everyone quarantined, and having those discussions and reviewing some policies. We still need more. We clearly need more, but I think it is a step, and hopefully we can continue being strong enough, those who are in position, to raise our voices and say, we need to talk about this. We need to make some changes.
I believe we need urgency, because what I fear, that history has a habit of repeating. We go post-pandemic. So at times with stories that are grotesque, our history, people have back away. They have empathy fatigue, as if I was doing you a favor by allying with you, and now the moment has arrived for me to move back. So this is why I say it's urgency. On the agenda when it comes to policies for trainings, for our educators in service training. And it's not only for the educators, but everyone who's working with kids and have impacts on them. There has to be an urgency, and it's now. It's not 30 days or 60 days with funding, or it's after we have a set date for this initiative or not. To be purposeful when it comes to Black history, you have to be on the agenda every day. Strategic planning when it comes to Black history does not start in January when you're planning pageantry for the month of February. If you're purposeful planning for Black history, whether you're a teacher, whether you're an administrator, whether you're a board of ed, whether you're a community leader, it should be in your thought. How does this impact my community? Because when it positively impacts the Black community, it positively impacts everyone. So when we Black and brown communities are at the table, it's not to benefit one group, it's to benefit everyone. Because sometimes it becomes, people are like, oh, it's complex. If we were able, one thing the pandemic has shown us, resiliency and how to move fast without having to think. Think about how we've transitioned to technology. In the past, it would have been on the agenda for 2 years how to have live streaming.
Right. Let's not pretend we can't mobilize and do something.
Right.
Exactly. Whether it's to put initiatives for in-service training, and it shouldn't be just checking the box, as if it's a CPR certification. You pump, you save. To save lives and educate our students so they can be global partners, Black history and Black and Brown communities have to be part of purposeful planning, not rush planning or pageantry.
So in a few minutes, we have some students that have some questions. And of course, I want the students part of this conversation, but I must ask one last question. I have to ask it. I'm gonna ask it. The Ferguson Library, again, so happy to be here. They have a section downstairs and they have a sign with a section dedicated to just Black authors. But I love what is on the bottom. It says it's not just for the month of February that they have this section of Black authors created. And it then forces me to ask the question, because people assume that section is just created for Black History Month. Now we have to talk about the future. Do we need to have a month dedicated to Black history in the future?
Yes, yes, yes. I will go back again, to celebrate our ancestors, to celebrate how they survived being pulled out of their homeland and surviving in several various continents. That's our tribute. And also, it is to mark and always, it's a symbol of the movement of Dr. Martin Luther King. It celebrates the past, the then, and now. Black History Month cannot be told in 1 month, because every day there's a first. Every month there's a first. Whether it's the first vice president of the United States being an African-American woman, there's always a first. So that's where to capture Black History Month. It serves as that pin. You know how in our emails we pin stuff as reminders? That's what Black History Month is. Now, our duty and our obligation is to find ways and mandate it to be enriched in the history of American history. Because in Connecticut, the history that's being taught is not the same as in Texas. The state of Texas, I don't know if you guys know, they're the state that purchases the most textbooks in the whole United States. They get to state to the publishers what they want in their history. So the education of history is not equal. Remember that.
That's where we talked about that. I think is important, starting at that same premise, right? Like I think we're always going to need Black History Month, because I think Black history in America is different than any other history in America. And it's not to say it shouldn't be incorporated in all the things that we teach in terms of history or economics or philosophy or any of the other things, but to have a month to celebrate what you're talking about, to overcome those kinds of things, a month isn't enough. A month isn't enough.
And I just want to add, I think, just to add, I'm sorry, Ms. Perry, just to add to you guys, I think, and as I said prior, I'm not a fan of Black History Month, just not the fan of the content. I love my culture, my history, but I just don't think you can consolidate it. It's too rich. It's too much information that needs to be exposed. So I think as our society becomes more diverse, I think more, and with as new educators like myself at Sacred Heart, they instilled a lot of diversity into us with our teaching. So I think these type of conversations and this type of content is going to come out more organically. I'm hopeful of that. And also, so teachers are going to be able to integrate a majority of these things. But also at the same time, I just think that I remember reading in my multicultural class that in the year 2043, the United States of America is going to be the first minority majority country in the world. So just based off these type of numbers, I feel like we're eventually going to evolve into having Black history within the curriculum all throughout. As in, like, when we're learning about certain topics of his social studies, Black figures are automatically going to be introduced. So as you guys stated, Black History Month is the start, but also, like you said, it takes more policy, and we need that to go into the future. So for educators like myself.
I feel like I slightly disagree. I think that I think we've been here way too long. I think we're overdue. I think now is the time, as you're saying. And I think 1 month is slighted. I think, it's cheating the history of such a rich culture or so much experience. I think it is time for us to really start shifting and making African history a part of the curriculum. The textbooks we need to purchase new textbooks. We need to really look at it from American history perspective. And it needs to be inclusive in everything and not going from 1926 when Carter G. Woodson actually established it. I believe he would have thought that we would have been far beyond that by now.
I think, and don't get me wrong, I think that all of the things you're saying are correct in terms of how it needs to be in all of the things that we teach, right? So, but the month itself, I think is important because I think there's too many communities in this country that it's going to take too long to integrate this kind of education that we're talking about into those kinds of communities. And I think for that reason, we need at least a 1-month reminder to keep telling everybody how important this is. I'm afraid that we're not going to get there as quickly as you think we're going to get there. And I think that that's sort of where my head is at.
All right, it's 2:45. I want to make sure we get some questions from our students. I see our first question, Leah. Can we make Leah a participant so she can ask her question? Hello, Leah. I can't hear anything. Let me see if I can.
Hi, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Can you ask your question?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Leah. I go to Stanford High, and my question is, who decides what goes into Black History Month?
All right, so Leah said she's from Stanford High and she asked who decides who goes, I guess what information goes into Black History Month? That's her question. Anybody want to take that? Who decides?
Well, it really depends on the school that you're in and who's actually establishing and scheduling the programs, but every student should have an opportunity to have a voice, and those individuals that you'd like to be celebrated, she can make recommendations to her teachers first. You can make a recommendation to the principal of certain individuals that she'd like to see highlighted. But I think it's pretty much an individual school to school.
I think you're right.
You know what, I'll go a step further. You just discussed textbooks in Texas. I'm pretty sure then that would mean that Texas can also decide what goes into those textbooks. Can you then say that the person responsible for what we teach is who's buying the textbooks? I mean, is that then the answer?
Who you elect makes a difference. Your policymakers, people who are on the ground, because in Texas, remember, they're telling the publishers what I want. And it's legal for them to do it. And who is the publisher going to to listen to? So in Texas, you're electing your boards, you're electing your politician, and that's what they want. And they're getting funding for it, and it's within their right. So that's why I say it's important that we look at policies, because policies have major implications. It starts from the local level and then goes up.
Junior? Can we make a junior panelist?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, what's your question?
My name is Junior. I go to Greenwich High School. My question basically is, like, as a student learning these things about Black History Month, Black Lives Matter, how does it, when the ball is in like my court or like my side of the field, how do I like put these things into my passions? How do I then introduce or teach these things to other people who may not like know or like I guess basically agree with my side of the story? How do I start those conversations, and what do I even say in those conversations?
If I heard it correctly, sorry, we have a little bit of a delay. Is your question, this is Julian from Greenwich High, and you're asking, how do you have those conversations with individuals who don't necessarily agree with your views? I'm guessing in regards to Black history or Black Lives Matter. Is that it?
Yeah, basically.
Okay. Did everybody get that question? So how do you have that conversation with people who don't necessarily agree with your views? I'm guessing Black history or even Black Lives Matter.
Well, I think what I try to do in my classes is try to start from a common premise that we all want what's right for people, right? In general. And then when we can all agree on something together, we start to then move forward about, well, then what's right? You know what I mean? For in the next step or the next step. And I think there's a defensiveness, I think, that we naturally sort of get to. And I'm assuming that this person's probably sensing that defensiveness when he has these conversations with people. I see it in my classrooms when I talk about it, that we can bring up policies, and everybody can ethically be in the same mindset that everybody should be treated equally and everybody should be treated. But then when you bring up certain instances when they're not, there's this defensiveness that they personalize, well, I don't do that, or I'm not that person, so therefore, why are we having this conversation? I think that you have to make people comfortable in being able to express what they're trying to say and get them off that defensiveness. So unfortunately, I think that takes a little bit of restraint from people who are trying to have a real good, some kind of productive back and forth. I think patience is probably the thing I would suggest. Find some common ground and be patient, because a lot of people still do not want to have this conversation. They just don't.
And I would just add to that, the patience is key, and also trying very hard and deeply to listen to their perspective, even if you're not in agreement with it. But sometimes, just listening and trying your best to see things from their perspective and understand why they think that way and believe that way, and to do your best not to get into an argument, but really try to listen and try to be as understanding, and then approach and share your thoughts.
Dr. George Yancey, who's a philosophy professor down at Emory University, says that, he talks about how important it is to be a courageous speaker, but it's as important, if not more sometimes, to be a courageous listener. And that idea is you have to be patient for people. I mean, you need to be, but you also have to be patient for other people to sort of turn that corner to be a courageous listener as well.
Okay, I saw a question in the chat group. If anybody has a question, feel free to go ahead and ask. We've got about 6 minutes left. What are your thoughts on Frederick Douglass versus Booker T. Washington regarding education and the success of Black people in the United States? I'm guessing varying views. Does anybody want to tackle that one?
I think Booker T. Washington is an interesting person in history because of his idea that that Black folks should sort of should focus on the technical aspect of integrating themselves into society and start to earn money and start to earn those kinds of things. And I think Booker T gets a lot of people feel that Booker T. Washington gets away from the importance of higher education in the Black community, and I think therein lies some of the conflict with that, with that issue. And I don't know, I'd be curious to know what you all think about that. It was almost like there's a lot of critics of Booker T. Washington who think that, it was kind of that they sort of gave into, his idea was to kind of give into what white America saw in Black folks, and then like they weren't either capable of going to higher education or those kinds of things. And I'm curious, do you experience that, like as an administrator? Like, do you think that that's still a prevalent concept with
I wouldn't say necessarily in the community of color, but I think there are a lot of comparisons now today. They both have like a prominent spot in American history, and they're both extremely recognized and honored. But I think with like some of the generation now, the Gen X generation, many of them are starting to feel like college is not as important anymore. That that they, with the advanced technology, I'm sure you may hear some kids talking about that now. That having a college degree is not valued the same. So I think some of those similarities are we're hearing again today. So I don't think it's much different. Yeah.
A question coming in, and I guess I'll paraphrase a little bit. How do we hold educators accountable? I'm guessing that's in regards to the conversation we had about having those educating the educators, keeping them accountable, and obviously having those uncomfortable conversations.
Well, this is a student who asked this question, so I would say, as educators, we're always, encouraging students to use their voice, right? Self-advocacy. So if you want to learn about certain topics, especially during Black History Month, ask your teacher. You can come to your administrators and talk about these things. I believe that educators are held accountable through students as well, also from administration. So I think it's just students using their voices and talking about what other prominent figures can we speak about. I think that can open the door, right? Because in the classroom, we're always trying to build our classroom community, and that's another way that we can cultivate that.
I'm big on students' voice, raising their voice and sharing their experience in advocacy. But also, too, we have to hold the adults accountable, because oftentimes we're pushing the students to say what we don't want to say. And I think it's important as adults, we should not ask students to do something that we're not willing to do. So if we're encouraging them to advocate, we need to encourage ourselves to hold our colleagues and our administrators accountable. Because if accountability, think about it, we're all held accountable in our lives. So if we were not held accountable, just imagine how society would be in certain levels. So I think it's important, one, look at the policies. How are we holding them accountable when it comes to when it comes to sharing our history? I think that's important. And it's not saying that we do acknowledge certain people, there's going to be pushback, but there's always pushback in everything. There's pushbacks in selecting the right ice cream truck for a party. So I think if we're being genuine with the conversation, we have to look at our policies. What do we want, and do we want it? Because oftentimes we're saying that we want to hold people accountable. Holding them accountable is the beginning, but the people who are doing the oversight, do they want that? Are they going to hold themselves accountable to making sure the structure works? So I think those are important, and we should hold everyone who are working and are empowering our kids accountable, period.
Okay, but I just want to add, can I just add one more point to that?
One more point, because I want to make sure we get the last question in.
But the only thing is why I say I feel like students should advocate for themselves more, because we see in this previous election with the voter turnout, with the amount of young people that stepped up and raised their voice. So as educators, we're always going to try to push for different, different concepts and stuff that we could talk in the classroom, presenting it to our administrators before we teach it. But I just think that, students' voices are so powerful. And if we instill that early, like at an early age, the amount of change that they can make when they get older, it's like, okay, so I advocated for this with Black History Month. Advocating for my community is going to be no problem. So this may be a stepping stone for them when they get older to make changes within their own community and, potentially within our entire state, and so on and so forth. So I think that, students using their voice and really advocating for what you want in your education, I think that's really powerful.
And I agree with you 100%.
Okay. Our last question, and I believe it's an educator asking, I'm not sure. What do you consider, and everybody can chime in, what do you consider to be essential reading for Black history so that educators can better integrate Black history into world history? That'll be our last question.
I would say at a high school level, Native Son by Richard Wright.
I would say The Half Has Never Been Told.
Culturally Genius.
Autobiography of Malcolm
I
X.
was about to add that.
That too.
All right, so you just got 4 examples right there. It is 3 o'clock. I want to thank everybody so much for coming to have this discussion. And you know, I think the room was even split in, do we need Black History Month in the future? Some said we definitely need it to continue those conversations for now in the next 300, 400, 500 years. Others say we need to get to a place where it's automatic and we're having that conversation from September until June, especially within our schools. I think that's a good place for us to leave it for now until next year. I want to thank the Ferguson Library again for sponsoring this discussion today. We're excited to be working with them. And again, they do have 2 events coming up on March 11th. The first one is Lies My Teacher Told Me and How to Avoid Them by author James W. Lowen. And then they also have another event April 15th, which is Register for a Novel Affair. It's a free event. Both of those events you can find on the Ferguson Library homepage. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everybody at home.
Thank you, Fritz.
And as always,
You.
I
Thank
hope
you.
that everybody can continue those conversations wherever they are.
Thank you, Fritz.
Take care. Bye.